I have family members that are all in a typical evening in my house, everyone sitting in their own place with their own laptop or computer or
device.
yeah, and every once in a while you get up to walk the dog, go get a glass of orange juice, you say hello, hello.
Oh, you guys say hi to each other.
We do.
We sometimes do that, but often headphones are on, so it's just kind of like
a
nod.
Yeah. My wife keeps asking me if I would please use headphones instead, but I like my speaker. It's such a good speaker.
You just gotta find good headphones.
Well,
And it sounds like surround sound.
I am out in the garage, and I mean, I do have good headsets, but that seems like a waste because in the spot where I have the speakers plugged in, I would have to unplug it and plug in the headset. And that speaker is just, I mean, it's, you flip it on and the house power goes, no, not really.
Say that's a good speaker.
It's just, like it's got the bass unit here, and then it's got two little, so it's,
With speakers, you can listen to music in the shower. Can't do that with headphones.
Unless they're waterproof headphones.
Well, I don't. If I'm in the shower, I'm gonna have to provide my own music. That's. So.
I listen to music in the shower.
This is it for today. I do have that on. John is having his teeth pulled.
Oh, fine.
So I don't know if Evelyn hasn't been here a couple. Is she leaving for something? I forget. But you guys know I try to record it and everything is doable online. So that works pretty well. For that, I suppose. So today we're a little out of sequence, and that's well, number one, since we already started with the pragmatist, usually you do all of them at once in sequence, but I've got a gap here, so we don't do John Dewey until next class. And Husserl, who we're doing today, really should have preceded Heidegger and Sartre, since both of those are, in a sense, responding to Husserl. So I don't know how the heck I did this. I wonder if it had something to do with the arrangement of the text. Because if so, the text might be out of sequence. So Peirce, James, Nietzsche should have been, but we already did Nietzsche, so and that's because Kierkegaard and Nietzsche go together so nicely. And then we go in the 20th century, and the first one there is Husserl. So it was the text that sort of dictated this sequence. And the reason I did Sartre and Heidegger, well, they're both in the book before that, so I don't know. I suppose they should have had the text arranged differently, but in any case, so Edmund Husserl, ever heard of him before? Probably not. How about phenomenology? You've heard that because the title of Hegel's first major work was the phenomenology of spirit or mind. So you've heard of phenomenology, discussed it, and it's the study of phenomena. But it becomes a specific type of science. It's really one that Hegel's discussing, and it's definitely a response to Kant. So let's do some background things here. Wikipedia is actually pretty good on Husserl as well. Um, Biographically, some important things are that he was born in a Jewish family, and that is going to be important for a couple reasons. One, their interest in education, but his own father's interest in education was more in modern education than in the traditional Jewish boy education. So he ended up going to what was essentially the public school instead of the Jewish school in the local community, which means he ended up studying Greek and Latin. There's an interesting aspect to what's going on at the time, and that's Moses Mendelssohn, who is also a famous philosopher and considered by many as very important. Who's, by the way, the grandfather of Felix. Is that right? Yes, he's the grandfather of Felix Mendelssohn, who I mentioned when I pointed out that Felix Mendelssohn's birthday is just a few days off of Abe Lincoln and Charles Darwin. But of the three, Abe Lincoln, Charles Darwin, and Felix Mendelssohn, my own personal not preference for the accomplishments of the person, but their IQ, basically, suspects that meant Felix was had the higher IQ, just because the nature of the music was more mathematically puzzling than anything either Darwin or Abraham Lincoln accomplished. Abraham Lincoln just had lots of practice making speeches to the people in his communities. Remember, he was really an autodidact, right? Taught himself, studied with other lawyers, became a lawyer, spent many hours constantly being a lawyer for cases in rural communities where the court literally moved around, and so he got to really have lots of time persuading people, right? And then, of course, eventually became presidential candidate after losing for the Senate. He was in the Congress, Abraham Lincoln, and as he was a representative in Congress, one of the more outstanding speeches he made was in defense of Texas' right to succeed from Mexico, arguing that any state has the right to succeed from the larger, and does that strike you as being a complex problem for him later on? You know, as the president of the United States when the South seceded, he of course wanted to argue that no, you're not. You don't have the right to. So that's just interesting. But basically, I think the reason Abraham Lincoln's success was such is, well, he had a particular kind of Whig, Scottish philosophy that blended with a federal attitude. So that's maybe a little unusual considering, but nonetheless, he was banding together to spend tax money on big projects. One of the projects he was in favor of was building canals for transportation. It was a state project. It had to be federally funded. Couldn't have afforded that otherwise. Same thing with the railroads. The railroads crisscrossing the continent were during his leadership. But of course, the whole issue of states' rights versus the federalism was all part of his picture. but what I think enabled him was really his practice, his constant ability to give speeches. Oddly, his language was such that it's considered still today to be very beautiful because it was limited to a Saxon version of English. And the two main sources of his English reading came from Shakespeare and the Bible, not in that order. And if you think of it, both of the both Shakespeare, who was very Saxon in his very poetic English, by the way, it's kind of an interesting detail. You look at why Shakespeare's language is so poetish. And then Lincoln reading that and the King James Version of the Bible would have given him a vocabulary that's primarily coherently Saxon, while normally we would say English is such a hodgepodge of so many different linguistic traditions that it doesn't come across as very coherent and beautiful. But Lincoln oddly does, because he's actually coming from a limited linguistic source. Charles Darwin, of course, grows up in a family that encourages him to have lots of study. He was eventually supposed to become a minister, but he changed his mind. Of course, we know he was in biology. By the way, he had a stutter. He took a long time writing and thinking before he released his arguments and so on. He was fairly wealthy, so he could do that. He was in no hurry, etc. And he had lots of experience traveling, of course, because he got to travel on the ship, and that enabled him to see the biology in lots of different places for the first time as a European biologist. So that led him to basically accept his grandfather's theory about evolution and promote it. And so Brady, very successful that way. But it was again location that seems to have made him a significant player in the development of the theory of evolution. But Mendelssohn, I think, was absolutely a genius because of the way he was able to take music to that next step. By the way, he was also the one that rediscovered Bach and promoted playing Bach again, because really the tradition in music was that you would play the composers that were contemporary. You didn't go back over the history of music and dredge up old masters. But Mendelssohn, as a conductor, pulled up Bach and presented it to audiences who were absolutely amazed at it and appreciated it, and basically started then the idea that orchestras would play music from all time periods, not just the contemporary composers. So there's lots of reasons why Mendelssohn, I would think, is pretty significant. But his grandfather is Moses Mendelssohn, and Moses Mendelssohn translated the Bible. That's in a sense incorrect, because he took the German Bible and printed it using the Hebrew alphabet, so that the Hebrew, the Jewish people, could read the Bible with the alphabet that they were familiar with, which also, by the way, opened up German to them. The normal families would speak Yiddish, which was, if you're familiar with it, Yid was just basically the word for Jew, so it's actually Jewish, but Yiddish is actually kind of a mishmash between whatever language the community speaks and the Hebrew that kind of is the basic language that the community is already speaking in. So you end up with it's another language. It's almost like Ebonics, if you've ever heard of that argument. You know, when they argued that the people from the south of the United States were uneducated, didn't speak correct English. So young people from the wealthy houses were sent to Europe so that they could learn the king's English when they were teenagers, because they grew up speaking the way the slaves did. For good reasons. They were raised by the slaves usually. The white landowners didn't raise them. They let the Aunt Jemimas raise the children up to a certain age. So as a result, a lot of the kids end up speaking the slang that the slaves spoke, right? So then when they were old enough, they got sent to England so they'd go to schools and learn how to speak correctly. So what is that language that these slaves all spoke? It turns out that it's not just uneducated English. It turns out, on analysis, to be a language of its own, has grammatical rules. You know, so the typical way that you hear people use plurals and change the grammar of the sentence structure that sounds like it's uneducated grammar, turns out to be grammatically correct in that language. And where did that language come from? The conclusion was it was developed as a result of the pooling of the different natives from the different tribes into the various embarkation points from Africa, where the slaves were gathered and shipped. And so basically it became the language of people who were speaking all different tribal languages, became the language that they all spoke in order to understand one another, and the slave supervisors. I'm going like this with the whip. You know. It's kind of a horrendous history, but nonetheless, that's the case. So, but basically, linguistics has shown that if you go to those embarkation points in Africa, they still speak that language. And then when you look at places in the United States where that language has been protected, so to speak, mostly like in the islands along the Carolinas, it's the same language that is spoken in those places in Africa. And so basically it becomes obvious that you've got a full-fledged language that evolved that is referred to as Ebonics. And it almost became the law in California that Ebonics was accepted as its own official language, so that you would have to hire teachers who could speak Ebonics so that they could teach the children in their classes. But the Californians voted against it, so it didn't get approved there for that purpose. But the goal of that project, by the way, was to stop people from insulting young kids that would come to school for an education, all of whom spoke Ebonics, because at home they spoke Ebonics. And the only person they would get to meet who would speak what we would consider proper English would be their teacher, who would act as if they were stupid because they didn't speak correct English. Of course, the idea, of course, is that no, they're not being stupid. They're speaking their language correctly. It's just their language is not the same as what's considered to be proper English in the American culture. And so that's kind of interesting. Yiddish, in a sense, was very similar to that kind of language. So it's not Hebrew, but nonetheless, the Hebrew speakers wouldn't stick to their classic Hebrew. Instead, they would move on to a mishmash between, and by the way, mishmash is a Yiddish word. As English is a mishmash, actually, between a whole bunch, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so Moses Mendelssohn does something very interesting, and that is he translates heard this before? Is this news? The Biderists, class of Jewish biblical exegetes, which means they explain it, right, of the school of Moses Mendelssohn. He compiled for his children a literal German translation of the Pentateuch into etc. And you could actually see images of it.
So the Bible was originally in Hebrew, right? And
The
then
Old Testament was in Hebrew.
Old Testament.
The
Not
New Testament was in Koine Greek. Koine meaning common Greek, because it's not classical Greek, and it's not the educated Greek. It's the common Greek of business that the Roman Empire used. Because the Roman Empire was not Roman, it was Greek. They took over the Greek Empire. And all the business and a lot of the processes were still in Greek. In fact, the Romans in Palestine officially would speak Greek, not Roman, or Latin rather. So in Mel Gibson's The Passion, where he has the Roman soldiers speaking Latin, is actually an error. It would probably have been Greek. Actually, probably wouldn't have been Greek even. It would probably have been a slang, maybe Aramaic, because the Roman soldiers in Palestine were mercenaries hired by the Romans.
They weren't actually Roman.
They weren't actually Romans.
So did Mendelssohn translate both the Old Testament and the New Testament?
It was just the Old Testament.
Just the
Didn't
Old
do the New Testament. Yeah. So the books that he translated were like the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. But what's interesting is that this is actually upside down.
Is it really?
Yes.
Oh, it says
It
upside
says
down.
upside down.
Yes. Okay. But this is upside down. If you turned it over, you could see.
Yes.
How do you do that? I don't know. I don't.
Why?
What's the point of
So that's
Yeah,
upside
why was
down.
it upside down?
So there it is. That's the title page right side up.
What's the point of turning it upside down?
Yeah,
That
that's
was
my
a
question.
mistake. It shouldn't have been.
Well,
No, it
The
keeps saying that
publisher
it's
screwed
upside
it.
down.
Yeah, but it shouldn't have been. So that's.
Wait,
Yeah, I don't know why that
I
happened.
think it's like an article talking about somebody turned it upside down in a different article.
I can't go back. That's interesting. Why can't I go back?
I think it opened a new tab.
It did. That's what it did. But in any case, so it's the German. It's German, but written with the Hebrew alphabet.
So it was originally, the Bible was originally or Old Testament was originally in Hebrew. And translated to German, and then he translated it back to
He didn't
Hebrew.
translate it back to Hebrew. He used the Hebrew alphabet to write the German words.
So it was the German translation
So
written
that
in
the
Hebrew?
people, right, so that the
Okay.
people who understood this alphabet could read German in that alphabet. Like if you try to read Greek and you're not familiar with the Greek alphabet, the first step you have to get through is learning the Greek alphabet.
Mm.
Still the biggest problem I have is when I'm reading, especially depending on the text and the way the font is, I have to figure out what the letters are. And Russian totally screwed me up that way too, because I learned the Russian alphabet much better, of course, because it was my career. And then when you compare that to Greek, you end up realizing that a lot of the Greek letters were the sources for the Russian letters. It was Peter the Great created the alphabet, Cyrillic, basically was playing off of Greek in order to create. So he basically used the Greek alphabet and then added some extra letters like sh, ts, j, ch, you know, and ch, soft sign, yaki's knock, torty's knock, hard sign. That's it, right? You know, so those things. Duh.
Yeah, you lost me just a little bit.
Sorry about that. But there's, you know, so there's a Russian alphabet,
Right.
Cyrillic alphabet. So if you see Russian, you think, that's weird, and it is. You know. But yeah, I had to learn Russian. I was a Russian linguist in the
Right.
army. I passed my French and German test too, but that was just for extra money. Okay, so that's Moses ben Mendelssohn. In any case, so Husserl reads this document, by the way, and it inspires him to like languages and things, among other things. But he studies Greek and Latin in school, so he gets a classical education. Mathematics becomes his favorite subject, and he goes on to get his PhD in math, writing his thesis about the nature of numbers. And what inspires him in this is the problem that's come about since Kant and Hegel and Schopenhauer, and that is the relationship between the real world and the phenomenal world. So everything we experience is phenomena, right? Now, if you're Kant, that means, okay, there's a real world out there that we can't quite see, hear, taste, touch, etc., because we're trapped in our senses. Comes from David Hume, right? Kant transcends this with his transcendental method to presume that there must be things that we can't see, hear, taste, touch, etc., but they must be there. For example, the ego, the self, must exist, otherwise I couldn't be experiencing it. I have to exist even though I can't see myself. The thing in itself, das Ding an sich, that has to be out there. Each thing that I observe and so on, that has to be there, even though, of course, I can't prove that it is. So Kant gives this metaphysical list of a prioris that have to be there, even though we can't prove it. You know, but the proof is that, well, it has to be there, otherwise you can't have experience. But everyone else comes in on this and says, oh, but you're doing something totally illegitimate. You're presuming that stuff exists that you can't prove exists, so you can't prove that it exists. And so you're wrong. You're being an idiot, Kant. You know, that's obviously, to someone who reads what you're trying to do here, impressive, but wrong. You can't do that. If we are experiencing the a priori and knowing that it must be there, that itself is phenomena. So Schopenhauer, remember, argues it's the will, which is like, we have no clue what you're talking about, Schopenhauer. You know, you've been reading too much Buddhism and probably drinking too much vino in the cafes, you know, and go pet your dog. You know, that's Schopenhauer, you know. There were fans of Schopenhauer, but most people claim they don't get it, and I understand why, because he's wrong. Wagner famously got it, and, well, you know, Wagner wasn't a philosopher, he was a composer. Great composer, but not a philosopher, right? Except in the normal sense of all of us being curious and wanting to know, are philosophers, right? So Schopenhauer basically is out of the picture at this point, right? Unless you're misunderstanding what's going on, I think. Kant has to be revised. We could say that a lot of psychology is born because of the problem that Kant sets us. Gestalt psychology seems to argue that all the things that force human beings, if you're rational, to perceive things categorically is because of the nature of our biology. And to some extent that certainly has been verified today. We can say that that's the case. On the other hand, a lot of that biological way of categorizing things seems to be cultural. So you have to be careful. You can't just say all human beings have the same biologies. Well, we do. But does that imply that we all perceive the world the same way? We don't, right? There's tests that you could do to demonstrate that different cultural groups perceive things differently. So definitely culture has something to do with the way our senses operate, right? You could explain that by, as Eric Kandel does, in The Age of Insight. Look at how many stars that has. Whoa. Considering the kind of book it is, that's pretty amazing. It's details about how your eyes work. That's a painting, by the way. And it's from the time when Freud existed and the Nazis kind of thought that artist was terrible, etc. Because he was Jewish, actually. By the way, Eric Kandel is Jewish also. So, kind of an interesting set of connections. In any case, he points out that if you use the metaphor of a computer, your eyes each have like these computers that basically have been trained to run the algorithm, to run the eye so that what you're perceiving is actively controlled by kind of a local computer in the eye that has been trained culturally. So there's reasons for thinking that different cultural groups perceive things with their eyes differently, and it's because you've been trained in your culture to pay a special attention to certain things. So it's cultural, but in biology, so it works together. So Gestalt is kind of one response to Kant. Another one would be Freud, of course, trying to figure out how the relationship between the id, which is the biology, and the superego, which is the culture, somehow creates the ego. Because the ego is the self that then is perceiving things categorically. And so how did your categories get developed? From parents raising you, peers teaching you what you were allowed to think and see, etc. Right? And then there's still others like logotherapy, which is meaning therapy. Viktor Frankl is a perfect example of that. Viktor Frankl argues that the main things that structure our perceptions of things is meaning. And the meaning, in a sense, we can have some control over. So you basically can be in charge yourself of how you perceive things. We were talking earlier a little bit about how some people are just so depressed with the way things are. But if you follow logotherapy teaches you that you're the one that's in charge of your own attitude towards things. It's a very stoic attitude. Mind over matter, right? You can, as the Marines say, you can embrace the suck, right? Rather than feeling like this is a terrible experience, you just, oh, this is great stuff. As you're suffering, through, no pain, no gain. All those expressions, basically kind of support that kind of attitude, that, you know, we do have free will, and so you don't have to suffer, you can enjoy yourself, you know. That's the myth of Sisyphus, right? He's, you know, constantly pushing the rock up the hill, only to have the dang thing roll right back down again, and he has to start all over again. You know, so it's like the metaphor for the most depressing kind of routine, you know, repetitious, boring life, you know, meaningless, pushing the rock for no reason, just rolls right back, and starting it, you know, meaningless, except if that's what you really love, is pushing that rock up the hill. Then you're in heaven. This is, I just love, let's start again, yes. Oh good, it's back down there again, I can start again. I'm gonna have a ball, this is great. Oh. It's all in your mind, you know. So a lot of that seems to be Kantian, you know, response. Where do these categories come from? And Hegel, of course, is wonderful in this respect, because he's the one that really gives us, along with, of course, some of his contemporaries, that it's culture. You know, and culture evolves. So what, you know, we might enjoy in life today isn't the same as what our parents enjoyed, or even we enjoyed 20 years ago. You know, culture is evolving, words evolve, meanings evolve, ethics evolve. Everything is in this kind of dialectical process of change, which is also known as evolution. Right? Becoming is the word that Hegel actually used. Becoming, it's becoming something else. So instead of the idea of a clockwork or a machine, instead we use as the main metaphor for everything is the oak tree, because it starts off as an acorn and grows, and then it becomes a sapling, and then it becomes a big oak, and then it falls down and it becomes rotten wood to feed the denizens of the Wald, the forest, right? And so you have this, you know, concept of becoming, process. So phenomena is in transition, which then brings up the problem of truth that we saw as a problem for the pragmatist. We'll see that more when we talk about Dewey next class. And that is, well, if everything is evolving, including what's true, because today we think it's true that all humans are created equal, and by who we mean by humans, we've explored all sorts of people that were not part of what Thomas Jefferson meant, for example, right? The words have changed. What we mean by that we think is true today, and yet they were false in thinking what they did then, but they thought they were true. So the concept of truth has changed. What's true, right, has changed, right? And if that's the case, that leads us to feel like, gosh, well, hey, what about things like mathematics? Doesn't mathematics seem like it's certain? We might argue that the reason it does feel that way is because people are much more strict when it comes to mathematics. So it's not like mathematics hasn't evolved, it has. It's just that when you get right down to it, the meanings of the terms in mathematics are much more strictly enforced, and as a result, that language game that we play with mathematics is much more rigorous than much more ambiguous kinds of languages that we play, right? Even ones that are scientific. You know, what do we mean by an eye? You know, is an octopus eye the same kind of eye that we have? No, there's differences. How do we say that they're both eyes? Well, they are, but they're not. You know, so it's very ambiguous. So what's the deal? Mathematics, you don't have that kind of conflict unless you get into some real strange aspects, I think, of mathematics, where you wonder about real numbers, numbers that are not quite real. You know?
Imaginary numbers.
Imaginary numbers, all the, is there a Girardelli? What's this one?
Chocolate?
Algorithm. I didn't spell that even close. Is that right? Okay, that's not the one I was thinking. Oh. Mathematics can be weird too. You just have to delve pretty deep, I guess. But the concern that Husserl has is, how do we find some sort of stable reality when, thanks to Kant and his followers that have explored it differently, that you basically have now a metaphysics that believes that everything is in flux, that everything is evolving. How can we then find some sort of stability in mathematics, especially? And notice, remember, he was interested primarily as mathematics, so his first work was on the concept of number, right? And he's wondering, is our mathematical sense psychological? Well, it is. There's lots of human psychology involved in the way we think of things as being a unit or parts. The kind of thing that Eric Kandel gets into, really, in his book on the Age of Insight, right? But at the same time, it seems like there has to actually be a thing in itself, so to speak, of the numbers. Triangularity exists, not in a physical. I can make a triangle. Well, it's not. It's a metaphor for triangularity. It's not actually a triangle. For one thing, it's terrible. For another thing, somehow you might say, strictly speaking, we can't have triangles, because theoretically the Earth is a curved space, and you can't have a triangle in curved space because the three angles, you're not familiar with this. This is a can of worms. I just opened it for you.
Mm-hmm.
So Einstein gives us curved spaces. And the reason that we're like on the floor and not, floating around like the folks up on this, the space station, is because why?
Curved spaces and spinning gravity.
So, ex-ne gravitiae. I don't know, my pig Latin's not good enough for me to have done that right. Ex-ne, and I got that right. We're moving in curved space, and the Earth is moving in curved space. And the curved space that we're moving in
Is moving in curved
is
space.
moving in that curved space into the Earth. So that holds me on it. I can push myself around.
Because, okay.
This is momentum. I'm pushing, so I'm pushing off of the moving Earth with my moving body in a way that moves me over this way, right? So traditionally we like to think there's gravity, but actually in Einsteinian physics there is no gravity. Instead, what you have a curved We haven't done this at all? Let me.
Einstein has a bunch of interesting ideas, relativity.
Okay, so this article looks like it's
Yeah, that picture's kind of what I think of from the curved space.
right. That's got to be wrong though, because curved spaces actually occur in every direction.
Yeah, instead of just.
So it's not like there's this blanket that the Earth is bending. It's
It's
from
hard
every
to-
angle you would see a blanket bending.
Yeah, it's hard to make a
this just gives you
3D
the one-
model like that. It's be weird.
How do I get out of this? I don't want to give now or ever.
I have no idea.
So, okay, maybe that means I can't read that one. Toughest test. So see, we're moving in this curved space, and the other objects around us are moving also in that curved space. And so the motion is what pushes us together. Although you can move away, like, move over this way, move over there. But it's like we're both flying in space. We push off of things. But the idea that there's some kind of universal force that's holding us down, that was like, Sir Isaac Newton invented that, thinking that it was a good explanation for it, but no, it wasn't actually, because everyone after Sir Isaac Newton was like, well, so what creates that? Where does it come from? Does everything have it? If so, what about all the other forces, in the universe, etc.? It seems like everything ought to just all collapse into like a black hole, and then never come out again. But no, there are other forces that resist against it. They thought, well, what was it? So how did I get into that? So Husserl once. I was talking about the triangle. So this is just a metaphor, where I just threw in there. By the way, we can't really have triangles because they require.
Flat.
Yeah, they require a
Completely.
flat surface, and strictly speaking, we don't have flat surfaces. Of course we have triangles. It's a different context. So what you do is you frame yourself, just like the Earth going around the sun going around the Earth, neither moving, both of them moving in curved spaces. There's lots of different models. All of them can be coherent, but you just got to keep them separate on your shelf, because they create
It's different models for
incendiary
different
emotions.
situations.
If you touch books to one another, keep compartments, so that. Okay, but if that's the case, and we have a compartment for mathematics, doesn't it actually relate to something out there that's true? And he felt like, yes, we do have these concepts, and those concepts in our brain are psychological, and so material, because our bodies are made out of substance that then have characteristics, etc. However, we're not wrong in thinking that those concepts of number and other things like and or not, those things are not just psychological. Those things actually exist in some sort of ideal sense, as opposed to just in our psychology. So Kant, remember, was a transcendental idealist, because we can transcend phenomena and recognize a priori ideals that must be the case. Yes, okay. Really? Remember, you still get into a problem with explaining where that comes from. And by the way, Husserl doesn't have any more success at that. But based on this, then, he feels he has opened up the science, phenomenology, now to followers. So he, by the way, is kind of typical. He's led people to this promised land, but he doesn't actually lead them into it. He just points, there it is, go get it, right? So of course all these other followers of Husserl now are going to go into the promised land. Obviously you can see the Moses metaphor, right? He's the one that opens up this new science of phenomenology. But all he does is get us to that peak where he points and says, there it is. So his works do not actually do phenomenology. They explain why phenomenology is this brand new science, this new field that is going to answer Kant's problem, right? And so we can go there and basically understand everything now thanks to Husserl leading us to the promised land. Right? So it's a great metaphor, I suppose. It's been used before, obviously. Did I get honey in my beard this morning? I didn't have any honey this morning. What did I have this morning for breakfast? Oatmeal with no honey. So maybe I have some oatmeal in my beard. I don't think so, though. I
Never
wash
had
my
that
face.
problem.
I wash my.
Yeah,
You don't
me
get
too.
oatmeal in your beard?
Nope. No.
You don't
Maybe
either.
try-
No, I can't say I do.
Yeah, I suppose not.
I
Oh
will
well,
try no
sorry
shave
about that.
November.
It was a non sequitur. Didn't follow from what. That's one of the reasons why you shouldn't go like this while you're lecturing. Okay, so great metaphor. It's been used before. And his name is Edmund, not Moses, but you can see that he's familiar with it. So where does this phenomenology lead to? What practical thing does it lead to? Well, the two most significant students would be Heidegger and Sartre. Heidegger especially, who had quite a complex relationship with Husserl, because he was not only his student for many years, but also his assistant for many years. And when Husserl retired, Heidegger ended up in being given his chair. You know what I mean by that, right? His funded teaching position, right? Is referred in academic circles as a chair. And so he ends up basically replacing Husserl when Husserl retired. Husserl didn't quit. He continued to work on his books after that. In fact, if we think of three major periods in Husserl's life, they go by the universities he was at: Halle, Göttingen, and Freiburg. And Freiburg is where Husserl teaches Heidegger, where Heidegger ends up with the chair after Husserl retires. But so those three periods are associated with his evolution and his understanding of what he's doing and how phenomenology develops. But so Heidegger ends up, so all of Husserl's students basically continue on working with phenomenology, but they all change it. So none of them actually do exactly what Husserl was trying to do. Heidegger continues the quest to try to understand the nature of being, and his major work, Being and Time, I think I already mentioned briefly Sein und Zeit. Problem, I just realized, okay, Sein und Zeit. So, fortunately, it still came up in English. The title we used was German. So, being, what is the nature of being? And we, as individuals, are Dasein, because we're being there, right? Now, remember, Husserl was still around, and so he critiques his student Heidegger and his book Being and Time by arguing that what Husserl was trying to find was a ideal existence outside of our human psychology. By changing it and changing phenomenology to a study of Dasein, Heidegger makes it anthropological. It's now human-centered Dasein, because we are there, and so being is for us. That makes it psychologically anthropological again, which is what Husserl was trying to get away from, right? He didn't want it to be dependent on our humanity. He wanted to find a way to get outside of that limitation so that we could find out what reality was really like apart from our human psychology. And by the way, that's where the things that I'm familiar with in phenomenology stand. They're an attempt, and one of my required texts when I was in school was Vanderloo. These were books in my philosophy of religion class. It was a 2-volume set. It was basically an encyclopedia of how all different ethnicities, cultures, religions treat different topics in religion. Sacred
tell us about this?
Yes. And this is an example of phenomenology. If you look at the broader title, this is one of Vanderloo's other books, by the way. Just personally, I don't think it's anywhere near as interesting. Sorry about that. If you're interested, I can try to find it. It's in my garage. So these are all books in the phenomenology of religion. For those, if you page in to the text, maybe? Oh, I can. I can page in. You remember that? That's a quote from Goethe. And you can see the topics. Power. How do different cultures refer to power? Theorizing about power. So notice how this works. All of these different cultures have all these different ways of dealing with a specific topic that exists for all of them. So phenomenology is an attempt to use all of mankind's experience of the phenomena of something to identify that something. So, and by the way, you don't take your own cultural perspective and impose it as like a filter on what all these other cultural experiences are, right? So the wealth of phenomenology is to get all of their experiences and just lay them out before us so that we can understand humanity's experience of power, theorizing about power. Yes?
You're like taking all the subjective views of it to try and make an objective.
Yes, excellent, beautiful expression of that. You see?
Yeah.
So this is like a little complex, I suppose. Because in order to get to the problem that they're dealing with, you have to go through Kant, Hume, Hegel, right? And, so sociologists basically are looking at everybody's experiences of poverty, everybody's experiences of wealth, everybody's experiences of God, right? And they don't come around and say, okay, so the Scots from Edinburgh have a better conception of God than the Scots from Glasgow. No, sociologists don't tell you anything like that. That is totally against their whole point in being sociologists, where their job is to just tell you what different societies think. Different groups of people think this, and this, and this, and this. And they don't try to impose to say this is the best. I mean, there are some, of course, that will say, Denmark is the happiest country, or something like that. But you know what? That's bad science. For lots of reasons, you could go into that and you say, well, wait a minute. Let's pull this apart. And you're comparing apples and whipped cream. It's not even oranges. It's way out there, right? For one thing, get this straight, Denmark is one of the most boring places to exist. Because they don't have any of this. You cannot see this in Denmark. And if you want to raise your spirits, you need mountains, right? Actually, there was a stupid joke in the paper that said, it's two ghosts sitting there, and one ghost says, I'm sad. The other one says, well, you should take an elevator, because that would raise your spirits.
I mean, yes.
Yep.
But
You said that was in the paper?
Pardon?
That was in the paper?
I think so. Might have been the Washington Post. I don't know where. I read the whole paper this morning. It might have been in the comics. I know I didn't think of that. I have to footnote my sources. Okay, so sacred environment, sacred world above, sacred conjoined world, animals. Some cultures, animals play a much more important role. I have a dog. Actually, I have 3 dogs, and she's very important to me. I pet her this morning, and I said how wonderful she was. I didn't want to give her grief for making so much noise, because when I let her out at 7:30, she barked first at the one neighbor, then at the other, and then at everybody over in the circle. And I was standing there yelling in my underwear. So, I'm not going out in 9-degree weather in my underwear in the snow to yell at a dog. She should come in and be quiet, but don't get mad at dogs. By the time they come in, they don't realize what you're mad at them for, right? That is the sacred world above. Why do we not think of the sacred world below? It's like, you know, right? I mean, you know, and besides this, now of course we've got satellites. We've got a space station up there. With my Oculus Rift, I can almost always start somewhere out in space. You know, there's the sun. You can look around, no heaven, unless what you mean by it is that's the heaven. You know? The form of the mother. Mothers are important to every culture. So you've got it. You've got the whole point of this, you know, but you can see the mighty dead. All of these topics are transcultural, multicultural, and yet they have differences, of course. How we treat water, if you have water that's a lot less significant to us that have tons of it compared to someone in, say, the Saudi Arabia oases, where you've got just a small little bit, right? You can imagine, right? Sacred life. Now, and notice how small each of these sections are. So, representation, the king, from page 214 to 216. So, if you go to that, you're going to see like, sections talking about how it's treated in Sudan, how it's treated in France, how it's treated in wherever, right? The speaker, the preacher, the consecrated, etc. So it's like an encyclopedia of these topics, giving you a variety of the culture's concerns, how they react, their art, and things of that sort to specific topics. Because what it's trying to do, as you pointed out, is we're going throughout all these different subjective points of view to try to glean some insight into the objective source of all of those ethnic experiences. So phenomenology. That's good. That's a terrific way of looking at it. And as far as I understand things, this is still pretty much the going concern for sociologists. Not the only one, of course. Sociologists are also concerned about changes in society, what might help. Is our society improved because of the legislation that so and so passed? Just look at our situation here. Since we've passed changes in, the way criminal cases are handled and jailed and so on, has that increased the crime in our area, or have we not let that legislation have its impact yet? Right? Well, we have to actually fund the changes that we said. Okay, we'll let people out of jail more frequently, but we're going to fund people to help them from being recidivists, not to sin again, basically. No, we didn't fund that. So we were letting people out of jail, but we're not funding the programs that were intended to help us keep those people from going to jail again. And as a result, they're going to jail even more often, because they're getting out more often, and we're not funding the things that we thought might actually help, and that have helped in other states in the Union, which that whole model was based on. So basically, we didn't put it into practice because we didn't fund it. And if you think, well, that might explain why it didn't do very good. But on the other hand, who has the money to fund those things when we're in the third year of a recession? In the long run, it might make it cheaper than housing prisoners at $45,000 a year apiece. On the other hand, it might actually not work. So, oh well.
Everything would be so much easier if there wasn't money. but money seems like a necessary evil, I guess. Maybe not evil, but
Yeah, money. Well, I have a feeling money is one of the topics in there, but,
I wonder how much that's limited by like language, that different cultures might describe the different topics by their language, and looks like the books in English might not be able to explain some of those topics as they.
Because
Does that make
when
sense?
cultural anthropologists go visit a community, one of the first things they have to do is learn the language. I think I've mentioned Everett and his conflict with Noam Chomsky.
Oh, yeah.
That there's a interesting difficulty there in trying to find a universal grammar. In a sense, Noam Chomsky's doing phenomenology. He's trying to say, okay, we all got this language skill, as Steven Pinker refers to it, the language instinct. I'm sure he's not the one that coined that, the language instinct. That's one of Steven Pinker got his start really in being interested in languages. Did you tell me that?
I don't think so.
One of my students just did a term paper on Steven Pinker. And it's neat when I get these kinds of term papers that help me learn more about who you guys are writing about. So that's kind of the. There are lots of interesting issues regarding the, and I didn't talk about Sartre. Sartre, in a sense, is also anthropological in his examination of being, but he is critical of Heidegger as well. I think his critique comes later, and I think it's too late for Husserl to be familiar with Sartre's work. I don't know how many years Sartre got to actually study with Husserl. It was when he was younger, and was in Germany studying with Husserl. But remember, he's French, and he goes back to France. So. And Husserl does die. And as a result, I don't know the connection there. But I better quit, I guess. Hope that was interesting. Edmund Husserl, considered by Wikipedia to be one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, but guess what? As you guys pointed out, never heard of him. That happens too. But that's why we're having a class on Husserl, so that now you've heard of him, so you can knock the socks off of other people that have known. So I need a good quiz question. I like the gravity thing. Maybe I should ask you to check and see how does Einstein explain briefly. You don't have to give me formula.
Okay.
Formulas. Formulae.
Formulae?
Formulae?
I have no idea.
I think it's formulae.
Formulae.
Yeah, I studied
Formula.
Latin when I was in high school. I should know which declensions are which, right? Declensions are the nouns, sorry, conjugations. So, no, but it would be declensions, because formula is a noun. Formula, formulae, formulae, formulam, formulas, nominative, genitive, locative, right? The cases. Change the ending. And the plural would be, what is the plural of formula?
No idea. Formulas?
Don't you just put an S?
Yeah.
Formulae.
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 spoke correctly?
Yeah.
Woohoo! It gets hard though. What's the plural of penis? No, that's not the quiz question. The
Okay.
quiz question. See, it's hard, right? Because you right away you want to say penises, because that's what everybody says. But if you look it up, you discover that
And I feel like that's rarely described in a plural form. So I've never really thought about that.
Yeah, can't say I have.
Peni. I don't know.
it's not my fault. It's the nature of English. But so, you know, the interesting question I think would be, what is Einstein's explanation for how we stay on the earth so that you're able to sit? It's worse, like if you're thinking this way when you're driving down the Glen Highway, because you're thinking, okay, so the earth is spinning. That's one motion. Roughly what, 2,400 miles an hour? Because
Sure.
we turn 24,000 miles in a 24 hours. We go 1,000 miles. So roughly 1,000 miles an hour we're traveling on the earth, right? And it's heading east, spinning towards the east, which is why things look like they're coming up in the east. They're not rising, we're turning, right? And so, of course, if your compass tells you you're traveling north, you're still going that way,
Right.
but you're also traveling in another direction plus, right?
Like
So just think the geometry involved in that, right? Plus that, you know, you think, wait, you know, so if the earth is moving in that direction and I'm traveling in that direction, I'm pushing against the earth pushing that way in order to keep going, especially if I go the other way,
And it's all
Yeah.
relative. Like,
right?
Yeah.
you're going east, but
And that's not the only motion, because
No.
we're also traveling around the sun,
Right.
which is another motion that we're, of course, going with the sun. Thank goodness.
Yes.
Imagine lying down in bed, you know, drifting off to sleep. When you wake up, you're thousands of miles away from the earth because you forgot to stay on it. No, we don't have to worry about that.
True, we don't.
But yeah, gravity's not really part of the picture. It's not my fault. It's not my fault.
it's just the way
Maybe
things are.
I'm misunderstanding the whole thing. That could be. You guys can come back and explain to me